Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. Gossip regarding the future of James Bond is obviously nothing new to us fans at this point. It feels like, every few weeks there'll be an article that drops with some speculation or whatnot. So I think it's very important to make a distinction between the articles that I think are worth talking about, quite frankly, and the stuff that isn't necessarily worth talking about. This is definitely in the former. This is an article that dropped on Deadline on September 24th, 2025, and the reason why it's worth paying attention to is because it comes from Baz Bamidj-Boye, who is an entertainment reporter with a pretty good track record regarding scoops when it comes to the future of James Bond. And indeed, there are some very interesting little tidbits in this article, so I'm going to pick out some select passages from it to share with you, and then we are going to talk about what this could potentially mean, the validity of it, and I guess whether or not I'm a fan of any of these particular choices. Please, obviously, do let me know your own thoughts in the comment section below. Really enjoy reading comments when it comes to the future of James Bond, what people are into, what people aren't into. So, with that being said, let's get into it. Denis Villeneuve will embark on the search for an actor to play the world's most famous fictional spy, James Bond, next year when he completes production on Dune Part 3. Those familiar with the matter tell us that the director and his collaborators are seeking a fresh face to take on the 007 mantle in Bond 26. Also, James Bond will be a male, as written by creator Ian Fleming, and importantly, will be an actor who hails from the British Isles. Those in the know tell us the ideal approach is to cast an unknown, possibly in his late 20s or early 30s, to play what Fleming called a blunt instrument, the lethal but extremely dull, uninteresting man to whom things happen. Whoever it is has to look like he could kill you with his bare hands in a tris. From the moment you see him, that has to be readily apparent, a person close to discussions tells us. So obviously this is very interesting. First of all, I think from a production standpoint, the idea that Denis Villeneuve is going to finish his Dune film before fully diving into casting for Bond 26, I think this is interesting because we have been speculating kind of, even when he was announced as director, he was, I think, just about to start filming the third Dune film, and I remember there was a lot of speculation, myself included, of kind of like, okay, well, how available is he going to be for Bond if he's off doing another thing? Obviously, filmmakers can work on multiple projects at different stages and what have you. I think Ridley Scott is a perfect example of this. He seems to have one gigantic, big-budget film out every single year, which is kind of insane. Obviously, Stephen Knight has also been confirmed as coming on board as the film's screenwriter, so you get the sense that wheels are moving, but it seems to be, they seem to certainly want a script, I'm guessing, like, in a fairly completed state, before they start looking for Bond, and particularly when Denis becomes more available. This is obviously quite telling if true, because it means that, well, I mean, those of us who were, holding the optimistic hope that perhaps the film could come out by the end of 2027, if they're only really getting into the weeds of casting, like when Denis done with Dune, and maybe that doesn't necessarily mean he's gonna dive fully on board with Bond, like when the film is released, when Dune is released, because obviously there's going to be a lot of post-production work. I believe that as of time of me recording, filming is still ongoing for that film. Obviously there's going to be a big post-production stage with lots of special effects, that needing to be done and what have you. I mean, I did keep kind of holding on to the thing, well, they did only announce Daniel Craig as Bond in October 2005. Casino Royale came out in November 2006, so like literally 13 months, and sort of, I guess if they are really ambitious, they could maybe still push for that. Later on in the article, and we'll get to it in a bit, it does say that filming is actually really only expected to start in 2027, so that would likely mean a 2028 release date, which will mean the biggest gap in between Bond films, well, ever, if we're going from, 2021 when No Time to Die was released to 2028. There we go, biggest gap in between Bond films ever. But obviously there are the details about the casting itself, so the ideal approach being to cast an unknown, possibly in his late 20s, early 30s, is very telling, because that immediately rules out, and the article talks about this, so many of the names that are constantly going around in the discussion space. So the likes of Henry Cavill, of Tom Hardy, Idris Elba, obviously, and many of those names are just suddenly like, oh, okay, that doesn't seem particularly viable. And again, if these details are all true, like, that's kind of music to my ears in some ways. Like I've said before on the channel, if the new Bond is announced and the general sort of like reaction from the public is who? Like, I think that's a good thing. Like, I really like the idea of the new Bond being an actor with whom you can discover someone who has a body of work, and maybe there will be some people within, you know, tuned into film who are like, oh yeah, no, I saw him in that little drama film from 2 years ago. He was really great in that. I do, that fills me with hope, quite frankly, because with Amazon we didn't know if they were going to necessarily go for a big name marquee star to draw people in right away. So that part of it, I quite like the sound of. When it says possibly in his late 20s or early 30s, I'm kind of like this is a purely selfish thing on my part. I'm 35 years old as I'm making this video, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't somewhat look forward to a time where I had a Bond who was a contemporary, really, in terms of age. The sense that I get from, you know, the Bond fan community on large is that there tends to be, of the Bonds that people tend to hold close to their hearts, there is the first one that they experienced, generally when they were young, and the next one is the one that is of a similar age to you as an individual, like, and you're watching the films and you're kind of like, I guess it's that sort of relatability part of it. Which, obviously, if they do go for someone in their late 20s, by the time the film is released, that could well be 10 years younger than me, and I'm kind of slightly annoyed that I might be missing that boat. Just the idea that, I go from Bond constantly being a figure that is, older than me, to suddenly being a figure that is younger than me by a fair margin. I think a decade would be a fair margin. But I was kind of looking forward to the idea of like, okay, maybe it would be someone around about my age. So, someone in their mid-30s would maybe get my vote, but, again, this is a completely sort of selfish thing. I'm curious, does anyone else actually consider that as a thing? Like, would it bother you if, generationally speaking, Bond was suddenly kind of like skipped a generation, really? He's skipping the millennials completely and is going straight to Gen Z or Gen A or whatever what is the generation after millennials? Gen Y? I think it's also interesting the bit that says whoever it has to look like he could kill you with his bare hands. Like, that's an interesting quote, I think, and it's in reference to some of Stephen Knight's previous work as well. So SAS Rogue Heroes, Peaky Blinders, Eastern Promises, all of them featuring kick-ass bone-crunching scenes. So the idea that they are going to go for a Bond that's really tough and rugged is, I think that's quite exciting. Oftentimes when it comes to speculating about Bond actors, and so much of the time, it's young, pretty-faced actors that are being suggested, and a big detractor, I think, for a lot of people is if Bond looks too baby-faced. And I've seen some of this in relation to 007 First Light as well, and the actor that's cast there, Patrick Gibson. Some people critiquing that because it's like, oh, he just looks a little bit too baby-faced. Doesn't bother me too much necessarily, but if they are going to go for someone who, as it says, looks like he could kill you with his bare hands, that suggests to me that they are going to go for someone with a bit more of a rugged energy. So now we're coming up to something that I think is potentially the most interesting tidbit to come out of this article. There's a sense from the many conversations I've had that Knight's going back to Bond's beginnings as a Royal Navy commander before being recruited by MI6, the UK's foreign intelligence agency, to perhaps chart how Bond attained his 007 status. I want to stress that this is what I'm hearing, but to caution that none of this is confirmed or fully formed because the script is still being written and the direction of travel is still up for grabs. First of all, I just really like that little disclaimer's included. So often in these articles, they just kind of talk as if it's like, absolute fact. And I just like the caveat there to be like, okay, this is still, somewhat speculation. The situation is still fluid. This might not necessarily be true. If it is, I think it's really interesting on two counts. I'm going to start off with potentially my more negative-leaning one, because I'm certainly, and I've made no secret of this in videos, that I'm not, honestly, like, that big a fan of the idea of having another Bond origin story, particularly coming after 007 First Light, which we already know is going to be an origin story, and in the context of the game, I'm fine with that. But also because Craig's era started with him becoming 007, picking up the pieces of, what traditionally makes 007, like the car, the music, all martinis, all those things. And I would hope that the film isn't necessarily going to repeat all those beats. Like, I don't need another film where we hold off on the Bond theme until the very end. Like, and I'm saying all this, I love Casino Royale to bits. I think it's a phenomenal film, really terrific, but I don't want necessarily to have those beats repeated, particularly because Quantum of Solace was a similar, obviously that was the second Craig Bond film, but it was treading a lot of that similar kind of water regarding, like, okay, he's still picking up the pieces of who he is, and we're not going to hear the Bond theme throughout the film and stuff. So, that idea doesn't necessarily fill me with all that much joy. That being said, and I say this a lot, I'm not necessarily against anything in concept, because if the film is a great film, then fine. Like, the Craig era, again, like, I don't know if going back to the start of the Craig era, I don't know if I would necessarily have, jumped for joy at the prospect of the next Bond film being a Bond origin story going back to the start of his career. That being said, film turned out absolutely amazing. I still love that film. It's constantly rewarding on rewatches. But then on the flip side of that, we have, the concept of Bond dying at the end of a film is a concept that, like, I wouldn't necessarily have jumped for joy at again, and then sure enough, when the film comes out, I didn't think it was executed particularly well. But that just goes to show, like I say, like, I do try to keep an open mind with these things. If the movie's amazing, and it just so happens to have a Bond at the start of his career, then fine, I won't be complaining. But the thing that I'm most interested in, and I think this is the most interesting thing in this entire article, the idea that the film could go back to Bond's beginnings as a Royal Navy commander before being recruited by MI6. That is something that we have never seen in the films. It's been, 1997, I think it was? Yeah, it was Tomorrow Never Dies, because we never saw Craig in the whole commander gear. It's been so long since we've seen Bond in that gear, and it used to be a real treat for fans, like when he shows up in You Only Live Twice in that, and The Spy Who Loved Me. It happens very sparingly throughout the series, but otherwise we don't really hear in the films, that is. I know, obviously, books, have expanded on this, but in the films, we don't know that much about Bond's history in the Navy, and I do think that it could be quite an interesting take and would help to differentiate this. If they are going to do a Bond origin story, I think that's going to be very helpful differentiation when it comes to, comparisons to Casino Royale. The idea, I would be, thinking about this over the last couple of days, I was kind of like, oh yeah, no, you know what, maybe I would kind of like if the film, let's say, started with Bond as a Royal Navy commander, he becomes involved in some kind of villain scheme, like semi-accidentally, but MI6 he sort of appears to them because they become involved, and they're like, oh, there could be something quite interesting with this guy. And the first half is him as a naval commander, and then the second half of the movie is him becoming integrated into the MI6 machine, as it were. I think that would be quite an interesting way to go with it. And again, I think it would give the film something of a unique identity in the canon. Like I say, if a good half of it, or maybe even more, is, Bond on Navy ships and out at sea, and, I think that could be quite an exciting, seeing him in a leadership sort of role, having to command a team, and I think that juxtaposition of him having that quite senior role in the Navy to being a newbie at MI6 and kind of figuring out the dynamics at play there, I think that could be really interesting. That actually fills me with a good deal of excitement. Next part is, this is in relation to casting Bond again, but it moves on to, could Bond be played by a non-Caucasian, I asked sources. He could, came the reply. As always, well, nearly always, it'll come down to this. Are they right for Bond? Are they right for the story that Villeneuve and screenwriter Knight will be telling? This is obviously something that crops up like any time, and again, these conversations feel like they've been happening endlessly, just, even in relation to the likes of, Idris Elba potentially being James Bond, Riz Ahmed, Henry Gooding, and there's a reason why these articles appear, because they generate a lot of clickbait, because there are people who are vehemently opposed to the idea of a non-Caucasian actor playing James Bond, the purist standpoint of looking at the source material and saying, well, okay, this is what Ian Fleming wrote, so the actor should look like, how he described it. Equally, there are people who were open-minded to the idea, and yeah, I suppose, you know, it'll come down to this: are they right for Bond? And that tends to be the mentality that you know, I've seen people express as well. I think it'll be interesting because if they do cast a non-Caucasian actor in the part, then that is probably going to dominate the conversation around the casting. And I don't know if Amazon would be necessarily inviting that, if you know what I mean. I do feel like there is going to be an impulse to play it somewhat safe in some regards to the casting. And, you know, certainly casting a Caucasian British actor, I think, would be, you know, a way of them sort of sidebarring any of those, you know, conversations. Obviously, you're going to have all the, is it too woke and all those kinds of articles, and I can't imagine that Amazon would really want to be indulging in that. But obviously, I don't think that anyone at Amazon is going to come outright and just say, yes, we are only going to be casting a Caucasian actor. So the idea that, you know, it's like, oh, well, maybe it could be, you know, I think that is going to be sort of the response. This next part's really interesting. An unprecedented number of applicants have already sent in their pitch to play James Bond to the production. Every name you've heard of and many you've never heard of. A well-placed mole revealed. We've been flooded, but understand that the casting process has not begun, and it won't until Denny finishes the Dune movie, they continued. So all those reports from, like, however many years ago about Aaron Taylor-Johnson has already filmed The Gun Barrel and all that kind of stuff, we can certainly discredit those, I think. But yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense that it's going to be a very high-profile role for whichever actor is cast. I can imagine it's going to be for the next year or two. Like, you know, yes, there's going to be a lot of agent attention spent on this. But yeah, as I say, this is going back to what I was talking about earlier about until Denis finishes the Dune movie. So again, finishes, does that mean filming? Does that mean until the film is actually released? Like, do we have to go? Because that film doesn't release until late in 2026, so are they, you know, is the next year kind of, is it about writing? Is it about pre-production? Is it about casting other roles? And then once it gets going, does it start to move quite quickly? And then the final thing about this article that I just wanted to touch on, our sources indicate that the film will be released in 2028, with filming due to take place in 2027. There's a lot of talk about the movie premiering in the November slot favoured by past Bond movies. I have been planning a video specifically just talking about why Bond movies tend to release at that time of year. It does tend to be sort of like October, November time, because there is, you know, there are stories behind why that is the case, and I would like to make a video dedicated to that at some point. It's interesting, though, if Amazon were to stick to that. Obviously, it's tried and tested. That is when Bond movies are released, and Hollywood can be quite superstitious about these sort of things, I suppose. I don't know if they'll want to rock the boat too much by throwing it in, you know, I don't know, June. But I think it's also an indication that Amazon are perhaps going to be taking the production a bit slower than Eon. As I mentioned earlier on, like, Daniel Craig was announced as Bond in October 2005, and then the film was out 13 months later. Casino Royale was out 13 months later. So when Eon, I know that, you know, we often complain about the gaps in between the films and what happened there, and there was obviously MGM financing issues and stuff all getting in the way, but once they, you know, hit the ground on the production of a Bond film, they tended to move quite quickly, with filming often like taking place at the start of a year, and then the film is out at the end of that year, which certainly if filming is due to take place in 2027 and the film isn't released until November 2028, that's a big chunk of time. But it wouldn't surprise me necessarily, because, and we know that Denis does not have final cut on the film, so I imagine it will be going through innumerable layers of company bureaucracy and executives and whatnot who will have notes and things to say about the edit. So I think in terms of Amazon just wanting to make sure that this is going to be a hit, people are going to like this, it's going to do well, the idea of there being an exceptionally long post-production phase for it, potentially with reshoots, you know, or space for reshoots and what have you, like, that doesn't necessarily surprise me. But obviously it is just slightly disheartening to think that, oh, okay, well, More years to wait then. I'm sick of living through all of the longest gaps between Bond movies. I feel like ever since I was born, it's just been, like, not that I was complaining about it when I was 5 years old, necessarily, and, you know, a year off from GoldenEye, but, you know, just, obviously the gaps of the Craig era, and then from Brosnan to Craig and stuff, it's like, I would kind of prefer it to come out soon, but that's just the fanboy in me, potentially. Obviously, I want them to take their time with it. I want them to have a great foundation from which more Bond films will presumably come a bit quicker. Maybe every 2 years is too ambitious at this point, but maybe every 3 years, something like that. I think that Amazon are probably going to hit the ground running with it, and they spent so much money acquiring this franchise, this character, that I have a feeling that they're probably going to want to make the most of that. But this film is certainly going to be a big jumping off point, I think, for them. And yeah, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like, does the naval commander thing fill you with as much sort of intrigue and hope as it does me? Because like I said, I think that's my most exciting takeaway from this article. The idea that, oh, okay, we could have a film that deals with Bond's role in the Navy and him as a commander. And I think that that's quite exciting. Do let me know below, and also below, if you want to stay up to date on future Bond 26 updates, then do click the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button. There's also links below to my various social media pages. And with all that being said, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.